Welcome to part 1 of 3, looking at chapter 8, and this chapter is on our second really big metabolic pathway, photosynthesis. So there's a lot of different organisms that do photosynthesis, and these include plants, which is generally what the general public thinks of when they think of photosynthesis. But in addition to plants, we have a few other organisms that can also do photosynthesis, and those include some of the protists and also a certain type of bacteria called cyanobacteria. So the protists, those are going to include the plant-like organisms like the kelp, diatoms, you have euglena. So there's lots of organisms, single-celled, multicellular organisms that can do photosynthesis. And then the plants, they include all the bryophytes, so like the mosses, ferns, the gymnosperms, so the conifers, pine trees, and then all the angiosperms, so all the plants that produce flowers as well. And this is just showing a picture of an animal that can kind of do photosynthesis. The sea slug, it eats algae, which is a type of protist, and then instead of digesting that algae, it distributes that algae throughout its own body. So it's kind of like giving the algae a place to live, and then the algae can do photosynthesis and then supply that sea slug with food. So this is an example of a symbiotic relationship between an algae and an animal. A little history behind photosynthesis. In the mid-1600s, we had a guy by the name of Jan Baptista von Helmont, and he did a super easy, really simple experiment. He took a tree, he put it in a pot, and he weighed the amount of soil that he added into the pot. And then after 5 years, he took the tree out of the pot. He again weighed the soil to see if there was any change after these 5 years. And he found that the change in the mass of the soil could not account for the amount of biomass that the plant put on, or how big the plant grew. So he was kind of thinking, okay, so if the plant isn't eating the soil or getting anything from the soil, where exactly is it getting the energy and the nutrients in order to actually grow, produce leaves, and to get bigger? So this is kind of a starting point of plants are a little bit different than other organisms. You know, what exactly are they eating? What's going on? In the 1770s, this is when we really got into more of the chemical part of this photosynthesis. So these two guys here, what they did was they looked at a plant underwater, and they saw that a plant underwater, it produces these gas bubbles. And they tested that, and they realized that those gas bubbles was oxygen. And then also, these plants, they're going to take in carbon dioxide. So we saw this exchange of gas between taking in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. And here's an example of a water plant that we'll be using in lab if we haven't already used it yet. And you can see the bubbles coming out of the plant. Those are the oxygen bubbles that are being released. So in 1845 we have Julius von Meyer, and he hypothesized that plants are taking in light energy, so sunlight energy, and they're somehow converting it into chemical energy or energy stored in food. So here we have a little bit more. We know kind of about the gas exchange. We know that we need sunlight in order to create this chemical energy that plants can then use to grow and reproduce. But it wasn't until the 1930s when we actually had a proposed chemical equation for this photosynthetic reaction. So here is that equation. So what happens is that organisms that do photosynthesis, they take energy within light, they capture that energy, and then they use that energy to synthesize a molecule, specifically to synthesize a carbohydrate. And then in addition, we can also see where the different gases come into play. So our reactants, we're going to have solar energy coming in, where we need water, and then carbon dioxide. So those are the three things that we need in order to do photosynthesis. The water part, we're going to rip the hydrogens off of the water, so we're going to oxidize the water, and we take hydrogens off of the oxygen, or off of the water, and that's where we get our oxygen gas that is released. And we saw that as those bubbles coming out of that water plant. The carbon dioxide, we're going to reduce the carbon dioxide, so all those hydrogens we took off the water, we're going to place onto the carbon dioxide, and that's going to convert that into an organic molecule, or carbohydrate for that. So we have an oxidation and also a reduction process that is occurring throughout this whole pathway that we're going to be looking at. So photosynthesis is really, really important. Photosynthesis powers the biosphere. So this is kind of looking at how photosynthesis and cellular respiration, how they interact on that bigger level of the biosphere and ecology. So the biosphere is just all of the regions on the surface of the earth, and that includes the ocean as well, and in the atmosphere, so our gaseous atmosphere that surrounds all of the land and water, where living things exist. And this whole biosphere, it's powered by this photosynthesis reaction that we're going through in this chapter. This image here is one of my favorite images. It summarizes our two big metabolic pathways we're looking at. So on the left-hand side, we have our photosynthesis that we're talking about in this chapter. On the right-hand side, you'll see cellular respiration that we talked about in the previous chapter. So these two pathways, they create what's called an energy cycle in this biosphere that we're looking at. So this really is the big picture of what's occurring on Earth. So if we start at the top of the cycle, so if you remember in cellular respiration we took glucose, which is an organic molecule, that C6H12O6, we added in oxygen with it, and then it went through those 4 steps of cellular respiration, so glycolysis, breakdown of pyruvate, citric acid cycle, and then the oxidative phosphorylation. And the whole point of that was to create energy intermediates that we then converted into all of this ATP. And that ATP can then be used to do pretty much anything that the cell wants to do. And then in addition to all that ATP, we also got waste products produced in cellular respiration. We had the CO2, so the carbon dioxide, and also we had water that was produced. And the neat thing is, this carbon dioxide and water, these two molecules, that's what we need in order to do our photosynthesis. So at the bottom, we take our carbon dioxide and our water. We add in energy from sunlight. It goes through photosynthesis, and then out of that we end up creating our glucose, our organic molecule, and we also have oxygen that's being released as a waste product. So you can see that these two metabolic pathways, cellular respiration and photosynthesis, they really power all living things in the biosphere and on Earth. Different organisms can do either both of these metabolic pathways or just one of these metabolic pathways. And so we can place organisms into what are called trophic levels, or basically like feeding levels in the biosphere. So organisms that can do both photosynthesis and cellular respiration, so they can make their own food and then they can convert that food into ATP, these are called autotrophs. So they can make organic molecules, so they can make their glucose using photosynthesis from an inorganic carbon source, which is that carbon dioxide. Specifically, we're looking at photoautotrophs, where in order to run photosynthesis, they use sunlight in order to get that starting energy. So we have green plants, also the algae and a few other protists, and then also the cyanobacteria that I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture. So it's a special type of bacteria that can also create its own food. So remember, autotrophs, they do photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Organisms that only do cellular respiration, for example humans and other mammals, we are called heterotrophs. So in order to get food, organic molecules, we have to get it from our environment, which basically we have to eat living or once living organisms in order to get our organic carbon that we then break down in cellular respiration to create ATP. So heterotrophs, we have to eat other organisms in order to sustain life, in order to grow and reproduce and do all those other things. Those autotrophs, the organisms that can produce their own food, these are also called producers because they're producing food. Heterotrophs can be broken down into further categories or trophic levels. You can have primary consumers that eat producers, which we have grasshoppers up here eating grass. And then we can have secondary consumers, so we have the shrews that eat the grasshoppers. So they don't directly eat the producers, but they get it through the primary consumer. And then we can also have tertiary or third level, so we have a barn owl up here that eats the shrew. So this is looking at a food pyramid, or you can also get food webs, which are a lot more complicated. But as you can see, basically from this, I just want to point out that photosynthesis, it does power this biosphere, and photosynthesis and cellular respiration, they're interconnected with each other in order to support life and to have living things. Okay, so now we kind of have this bigger picture of how photosynthesis and cellular respiration fit into the biosphere and ecology. So now we're going to get into photosynthesis and look at the little details of it. So remember, we need solar energy, water, and carbon dioxide. So we need those three things in order to make our carbohydrate, so our glucose, and then we also get oxygen that's produced as a byproduct. So in plants, we're going to focus on plants for this chapter, but remember you also have the algae and then cyanobacteria that can also do photosynthesis. But in green plants, they get water from their roots and they bring it up to the leaves. And then in the leaves, this is where we also bring in the carbon dioxide. Specifically, if you look at the bottom of a leaf, there are tiny openings in the leaf called stomata. And it's outlined in red right here. The stomata, these are those, that's Latin for little mouth. These are the little openings on the underside of the leaf where the carbon dioxide can enter in, and then that carbon dioxide diffuses into the cells and into the chloroplast. The stomata are also where the oxygen can exit out of the leaf as that byproduct. So if we look at a leaf, we talked about the stomata. If we zoom in, leaves are made up of lots and lots of plant cells. So we're going to zoom in on one of these plant cells. And I mentioned that in plant cells, we talked about chloroplast, if you remember back when we talked about eukaryotic cells and the different organelles. So photosynthesis, it occurs in the chloroplast, in the cells. So the chloroplast, they're made up of three membranes. So if you look on here, there is an outer membrane, which is smooth, an inner membrane, which is also smooth, and then the very inside membrane is called the thicoid. And it creates these little green stacks that we see in the chloroplast. This is where the green pigment is actually held in the chloroplast. So we are going to look at these different parts to see where the two parts of photosynthesis actually occur. So this slide here, just like if you remember in chapter 7, I had a slide that really summarized cellular respiration. This is kind of the equivalent thing for photosynthesis. So here we have our large chloroplast, and then we see the outer membrane and the inner membrane, they're kind of together, but then we also have that thicoid membrane in the middle. So again, photosynthesis is a little simpler. There's basically two reactions that are going to occur. We have our light reaction and we have the Kelvin cycle. And again, we're really going to focus on the inputs of these two reactions, the outputs, and then also where it actually occurs in the chloroplast. And again, it's really nicely summarized on this, so it'd probably be a really good idea just to print off this slide and kind of follow along. And I'll have it up here as well as we go through the light reaction and the Kelvin cycle.